International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate seeing so many people. And Professor Dyson, it's a privilege to have you here as well. And thank you for taking your time to sit here and talk to us about the election and all the different things that are wrapped up in it.
Thank you, my friend. Great to be here with you.
How's
this?
Are we better?
What up?
All right.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3.
Okay. So in the December and January issue of the New Republic, I had the pleasure of editing a story that you wrote about Hillary Clinton in the context of race. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating as how the story evolved as we were working on it together was that it became less about Clinton herself as a candidate and more about a split among black voters, if you could loosely group them as a black establishment, an elite, and the younger black activists. And one of the things I found really interesting as you were figuring out what you wanted to say was that I think it's fair to say that you were a Hillary supporter, but you had great admiration for the activists who were disrupting her events and protesting her. So I just wonder how you reconciled those two differing points of view.
Right. First of all, it's great to be here at the Oakland Book Festival with, all right, with my man Ted Ross. I call him Freud 32. He's a psychoanalyst, a psychologist, and a running back because he gets it back quicker than anybody else and does a great job. So it's great to be here with him, my man Andre Yetmer in the back, and my man Davey D up front. So it's great to be here. I've preached 4 times, so I'm juiced. I preached 4 times this morning, so I'm ready to bring the gospel right now. Take a collection and then get up out of here. So you're absolutely right that I had a deep appreciation for Hillary Clinton, but I also had an equally powerful compulsion to embrace those young people who were at that moment and have continued to push her and others toward a more progressive, a more open-minded, and a more engaged stance. I think that the black establishment, as I followed Hillary around, as you sent me around the country, as my boss and made me go trail her, which was great to see her in many African-American establishment settings where she was effortlessly convivial and engaging the audience, and there was a reciprocal feedback loop, so to speak, of affection and appreciation for her and then her back to them. The Black Lives Matter were much more skeptical, rightfully so, and much more willing to get in the faces of these people in power and engage them. And what I liked about Hillary Clinton, however, is the fact that she gave as good as she got. I mean, the way you take people seriously is by taking them seriously, which means you don't uncritically defer, you don't, with unprincipled characteristics, somehow play to the galleys without engaging them seriously. And I think she had some rather interesting and astute things to say back to them about, on the one hand, looking at an ontological assertion of black animus as the predicate for political organization versus a kind of, look, Martin Luther King Jr. said, the law may not make you love me, but it can stop you from lynching me. And I think the tension between those two is regnant, and it continues to inform different approaches and strategies from Black Lives Matter activists who rightfully underscore, highlight, and emphasize both the existential as well as the political, and a Hillary Clinton / Barack Obama / Martin Luther King Jr. along a broad continuum there of people who feel that public policy has to be instituted and engaging the facts on the ground, so to speak, without paying as much attention to the other factors that Black Lives Matter bring to the fore. So I think that tension continues to be resonant and continues to inform a lot of what we see going on today.
So the campaign's been ongoing for quite a while now, and I don't want to call the election just yet, but there seems a fair chance that Hillary will be the nominee for the Democratic Party. Right. And I'm wondering, all that's gone through in those months of campaign, do you think that she is now accounting enough for the wishes and the interests and the priorities of black voters? Has she done enough to make up for what you wrote about in your piece about the things that she had done wrong in 2008?
Right. Well, we can debate that, but what is clear is that she's been asked more to do than Obama was by the same activists, right? So now part of that has to do with chronology, when Black Lives Matter emerged and when they began to put the screws to these political figures. So in that sense, he is the beneficiary of chronological order, but it's also a kind of ideological and political moment where Hillary Clinton has had to be more accountable because she didn't have the innate advantages of Obama being a black man, or even her husband having that kind of slick willy charisma. And so as I tried to argue in that piece, at her best, what we would press her to do is to produce public policy that would at least respond in tangible and in convincing fashion. But yes, I think that she's been battle tested. Look, Hillary Clinton has been battle tested for a while. I think my own perspective on her, I mean, I'm loving our side of the table, so to speak, in the sense that Bernie Sanders' presence has pushed Hillary Clinton further to the left, and I think that's a good thing. And I think that we have not accounted for the sexism that has prevented us from seeing just how unfair some of the attacks and assaults upon her have been, and the demands that she comport herself with a certain kind of political utility and a kind of public performance of propriety. Like, when John Boehner cries, "Oh my God, it's an exemplification of the vulnerability of masculinity," she cries, "There's no crying in baseball, what are you doing?" And if she's tough, then, "Oh my God, she's shrill, she hollers." You got Pulitzer Prize winning, columnists and journalists beating down. Are we really preoccupied in 2016 with the character of a woman's voice? Is that what we're doing now, right? These kind of politics that fail to skirt. Okay. I've been preaching, I told you that. Metaphoricity is the central, preoccupation of the Black Baptist preacher at this moment. So when we continue to engage these issues in ways that don't acknowledge the invisible bulwark of patriarchal prerogative that is often deployed against her. That doesn't mean that there are no legitimate and powerful critiques to be made of her. It just simply says that we have to account for that. I think she's been battle tested. I think that she's had to respond time and again to these issues of race. And when I've looked back upon the speeches she's given over the last several years, when I stack those up against any other political figure on that side of the aisle, like an Obama and others, I just have to say that her speeches are deeper. They deal with more interesting perspectives on these particular problems. They are willing to close in on some of the specifics. For instance, in the immediate aftermath of Charleston, South Carolina, when Obama was barely willing to acknowledge that race was the critical feature of the chaos that had been unleashed, Hillary Clinton was already kind of deconstructing that and giving an entire speech out in this area, or was it in LA? I'm sure. No, it was out in this area, I think, to the mayors who were gathered, where she's really talking quite vigorously about systemic issues of racial inequality and how they have to be addressed. So yeah, I think she's been pushed, she's been cajoled, she's been prodded, and she has at least taken if you will, cognizance of these issues in ways that other politicians have not successfully done.
One of the things you said just now is that Bernie had pushed Hillary to the left and that was a positive thing. And I think that's self-evident as in the ways that the campaign has gone. But
Right.
couldn't you also say that the actions of these Black Lives Matter activists that you were so interested in, they had a more powerful role in pushing them both to the left.
Yeah,
and
that's
impacting
true.
the campaign in a greater way.
Yeah, see, that's why he's the editor. I'm just the dude writing. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Because for those, and I'm sorry, for the Bernieites who are here, the Byrne brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, the Byrne family, George Burns, I mean, whoever, right? Gracie too. So what's interesting is that the narrative is, well, Hillary is an inveterate centrist and the progressive politics of Bernie. Slow down, Mace, you're killing them. Bad Boy Reunion, got to shout them out this weekend. So Bernie himself, I know he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. or whatever, but there have been a few brothers since then, right? And even though that's a high point and dramatic, if you will, apogee through which the civil rights movement articulated its ideal impressions during the halcyon days of the civil rights movement, the bottom line is that Bernie Sanders himself didn't have much on-the-ground experience with the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of racial progress either. And arguably, whatever one thinks about what Hillary Clinton was doing, Hillary Clinton has had on-the-ground experiences and a kind of engagement, not only vicariously through her husband, by virtue of his associations, but her independent associations. As she was wont to tell me and anybody who will listen, her first job when she was in college was, with Marion Wright Edelman and funding her own internship with Marion Wright Edelman with the Children's Defense Fund. And as a side note, her son, Ezra Edelman, has just been the director for this remarkable documentary on OJ that you got to see, OJ Made in America. It's a phenomenal documentary. Check that out. I didn't think, well, OJ, is anything else new to say on OJ? Plenty of new stuff to say on OJ. So Hillary Clinton talks about that, and we can knock her for a kind of facile appropriation of blackness and the ways in which the mechanics and dynamics of civil rights movement have been deployed to substantiate her claims about, her intimacy with these communities. But she's paid her dues in ways that have not been acknowledged publicly, and she's done the, forgive the metaphor, spade work. Wow. I told you I just preached, man. I'm sorry. So, and in doing the digging up, the unearthing, and doing the serious work necessary to engage this issue, I just think it sets her in a different way. So yes, Black Lives Matter pushed her, but they pushed Bernie as well. Bernie talks racial inequality, but I'm reminded of a story of the late, great Derek Bell. You remember Derek Bell? And I was on a panel with him at the Socialist Scholars Conference, he and I together. And he was telling this story about when the communists were going to Harlem to recruit. He said, come on, the revolution is coming. And he said that a black man asked the communist, the white comrade, he said, can I ask you a question? He said, yes, after the revolution comes, are you still going to be white? Oh. So that whiteness constitutes not only a subordinate category that can be subsumed under the rubric of class, so that class is the primary configuration that race gets assigned to, but that race has its own legitimacy, logic, rationality, and irrationality, and physics that need to be accounted for. And in that sense, I think Bernie has not been adequately pushed in that way, not just making a faux pas about whether all black people are in the ghetto, right? And I never seen, I guess for me, I wasn't as offended as some of the other people were. I was like, yo, there's plenty of people in the ghetto. They still in the hood. They shout you out. Thanks, Bernie, for remembering us. But there's, it's a more complicated terrain. And I still think that for him, what's primary is inequality, and that black suffering is itself a subsidiary of that ultimately primary reality. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Both race and gender insert themselves and have their own not only integrity as a means of organizing protests from communities, but have their own analytical point of departure that needs to be taken seriously. So yes, that's a way of saying, yep, the Black Lives Matter people pushed them both in serious and substantive ways.
Great. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I mean, we have a fairly reasonable debate between Bernie and Hillary that's ongoing among Democrats that will have an option to vote for. But there's something else entirely different that's going on in the Republican Party. So I'd like you to think about that a little bit. One of the things you and I have been talking about recently is how in 2008, people around the country had an opportunity when they voted for Obama to be on the right side of history.
Right.
And that was both a wonderful moment and an oversimplifying moment, if you,
Right.
particularly if you're white. You felt that if you could vote for Obama, you could sort of pave over some of the transgressions, historical transgressions in this country racially.
Right.
So given that context, how do we get on the right side of history in terms of dealing with the threat that Donald Trump presents to this country?
Yes, sir. Hey, that's a great setup. Read the essay.
That's
New
not out
Republic.
yet.
That he edited. But like we were saying, one of the ways to get on the right side of history is to get on the right side of Ohio, which means in Cleveland, which means we got to be there, right? Or be squarely left out, marginalized. Look, to not take Donald Trump seriously is really kind of crazy right about now. And the fact that the very Republican establishment that excoriated him, that mercilessly pilloried him, now seems to be falling in line. And if you don't think a lot of those ducats are not going to line up, and you don't think a lot of that money is going to be put behind Donald Trump, because then he'll begin to adjust and sound more reasonable and be willing to defer at critical and strategic moments just enough. He ain't gonna get the Romney vote, but Paul Ryan seems already to be falling in line. Paul Ryan, ostensibly the legatee of Jack Kemp, sensible, progressive, or at least liberal conservatism, right? And the ways in which his heartfelt investment in issues of poverty are manifest. The point is that Donald Trump is a juggernaut, and the junta that is in the offing has to be taken seriously. And the way we get on the right side of history is we repent for our naivete or our belief that somehow by voting for Barack Obama, it was a fait accompli, that we, been there, done black, finished, right? Even among white liberals. Because, hey, we know that white conservatives don't want to deal with the issue of race except when they subversively engage in the politics of racial signification and inference, as Stuart Hall would call it. On the other hand, some white liberals were like kind of exhausted too. Do we really have to keep interrogating our practices and scrutinizing our rhetorics to make certain that we're marshaling ideas that are shorn as much as possible of the racial animus and the hostility that we so easily associate with the other side? So it's kind of work all over. The problem is, of course, that Donald Trump has amplified so much of the virulence and the virulent strains of anti-blackness, anti-Mexican identity, anti-Muslim beliefs, xenophobia. Whether we accuse him individually of this is almost irrelevant. It's what he begins to be a megaphone for and what he amplifies with his rise. And so I think that the right side of history is to vote against him, is to think critically and strategically, is to show up in Cleveland with megaphones and bodies on the line. When Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker and Joanne Robinson and Septima Clark and all of these activists were showing up. You're troublemakers. Why are you coming here? Putting their bodies on the line. And a lot of that was sacrificial. King said blood will be shed, but it will be the bloodshed of activists who will change the history of America. People thought he was crazy and chiliastic and idealistic and romantic, and yet that blood sank into the soil of America, and from it has sprung not only monuments that testify to the legitimacy of his ideals, but institutions that testify to the integrity of his vision, as hard as it was for us to hear it then. So getting on the right side of history now is to oppose what we see going on and to be vocal and to be articulate about it, and not just to armchair it and sanctuary it and, do it from the solace of our retreat from history, but to engage it as fully with as full-throated a denunciation of those practices that we see across the board.
Okay, but let's say the sky falls.
Yeah.
And Trump wins. And I think there is a
possible.
Reasonable risk that could happen.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
That's true.
what do we do? What do we do if Donald Trump wins? We're not all going to move to Canada. That's a cop-out. How do we reckon with the forces that he's going to unleash in this country? You talk about his amplifying some of the worst instincts in American culture.
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
That's a great point. Well, the first thing we don't do is to surrender to the cynicism, even though that's easy to do. Cynicism seems to be the product of people with leisure. People whose backs are against the wall never think they have a choice but to fight, right? So my pastor used to tell me, we've already gone through what we've come to. Like, this ain't the first time. Howard Thurman, the great prophetic mystic, said, refuse the temptation to reduce your dreams to the level of the event which is your immediate experience. This particular thing right here ain't gonna last always. So if we had slave foreparents, we being African American people and people of color, and there are many pedigrees and traditions of response, indigenous people from the Pacific Rim, those who have come here from various points across the globe, there are tremendous trajectories and traditions of response that, as bad as it is, as bad as Donald Trump is, as horrible as it would be to have a President Trump, we can't give up the project of what American democracy is about. We can't give up the fight for what this country would mean. Maybe in that sense, having lost the battle, we would be forced to overcome some of our ideological purities. And we got them on the left. They accuse us of having firing squads in semicircles. When I hear the Bernie people saying, hey, I'll never vote for Hillary, she's going to hell, be careful with the demonization. I'm not saying don't have a serious, even truculent if you desire, analysis of Hillary and think that she's the sellout and she's done, whatever it is. At the end of the day, however, to say that, well, if Bernie doesn't make it, I may either stay home, and I'm sure there are other alternatives, of course, the Green Party and the like, or some people among the Bernieites are going to vote for Donald Trump. I think that's a problematic response, that last one. I think the other one may be a vitiation of our noble obligation to not only vote, that's one part of it, but to organize outside of the vote extra parliamentary procedures that demand an organization that cannot be reduced to merely what goes on at the polls. But what goes on at the polls are critical as well. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So for me, I think that we can relegate the politics of purity to the margins it deserves and figure out ways to get on the ground to work together. I remember C.L.R. James saying Martin Luther King Jr. is as progressive a figure as one might imagine during the time when he was being pilloried by more progressive forces to the left, saying he basically had sold out to American ideals. So we don't have the luxury and leisure, it seems to me, to engage in that kind of nitpicking. Not that there are not substantive differences that need to be amplified and then engaged, but at the end of the day, maybe it will force us to work together in a way to oppose our common enemy so that those of us who disagree, even stridently so, will at least be reined in by the real possibility that we have to work together to figure out a way to get this guy and what he represents unseated in America. So should he win, we have to make sure he doesn't win. That ideal and those ideas that he has so viciously appealed to don't prevail. And as we said, Donald Trump, right, think about it, Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, not the monster. Which means then there's a womb that produced him. There are ideas that produced him. Donald Trump ain't came, to mix metaphors, born whole cloth he's not some Zeus invented out of the head of some mythology. He is the product of years of delegitimizing Barack Obama, assaulting people of color as if they are not real Americans, pushing others who are not central to the dramas of American idealism to those margins, and beating up on everybody who doesn't look like a narrow version of what it means to be America. Getting our nation back, taking it back from who? Who got it? Who hijacked it? Who had it? When did they take it? How much did they pay? Right? So when we do that, I think, then we don't have that sense of cynicism that would ultimately surrender, even if Donald Trump came into existence and became president of the United States of America.
Okay. Well, let me put you on the spot a little bit. You talked about ideological purity and working together. And I first came to know you personally when you wrote a story for the New Republic that I co-edited with my friend Jamil Smith, and it was about Cornel West. And you had a few choice things to say about him, as I remember. And I know that Professor West and Al Sharpton will be leading a march in Cleveland for the Republic to protest the Republican National Convention. And I'm curious, in the hopes and in the way of bringing setting aside our ideological purities and working together, could we see a rapprochement with Professor West and you?
Oh, absolutely. I've always been the one willing and desiring to sit down. Many people have approached Professor West and myself to do so. I've always said yes. He's not followed through, just to be honest. So I've always had a desire to sit down and have a rapprochement because I don't want to perform difference, battle, and inglorious infighting for the purposes of reinforcing a kind of notion that the battle royal prevails. But at the same time, you know, somebody calls your names for 5 years, you got to say, blah, slow down with that. This is what I mean by ideological purity. Professor West is castigating Al Sharpton, if he can overcome his differences with him, certainly with me, as prostitutes, me and Sharpton, Melissa Harris Perry. You know, you ain't God. And if you ain't God, that means you ain't got the ultimate determination of what another person's soul or spirit is. And, you know, we should be careful before we cast aspersions against other people if I disagree with you. And we can do so humanely, especially if we claim to be, I just finished preaching 4 times. I'm a preacher of the gospel. And I believe in that gospel. And I believe in what that might mean, especially when it's related to the dramatic impulse of social transformation and how we become agents of our own destiny. So, of course, I want to forge connection with Cornel and Al Sharpton and so on, and hope to be there. And I will be there to speak, obviously, at one point, and certainly, would stand in solidarity with them against what we see going on in this country. So yes, of course we can overcome our differences, but we have to scrutinize our own predilection to believe that our way is the only way. We gotta cleanse ourselves of those impulses toward purity and realize that all of us are soiled, in my tradition it would be sinners, and with the blood of history, and we have to wash away as much as we can, but we have to invite each other into a common destiny of opposing the worst things that we see in society, even as we agree that each other have to be taken on in strategic and principled fashion without being nasty and vicious. So yeah, I'm down with that.
Okay. When I last heard you speak in New York, you talked about President Obama's rhetoric coming out of the traditions of the black church, and you were interpreting him in that way, both for better and for worse.
Right.
I'm curious if you could turn that lens onto some of the other candidates. I recall when I was a child, I had an 8th grade assignment where I had to interview someone in my family. And I interviewed my grandfather who had lived in Nazi Germany. And he told me that the thing that most frightened him about Hitler as a young adult was the sound of his voice on the radio.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you could think about Trump's rhetorical patterns and the way he speaks in both of those contexts.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the easy allusion to crypto-fascism should not be overlooked. Occam's razor prevails here. The best explanation could be the simplest and the most obvious. The reason your father, and I don't want to speak, your grandfather, I don't want to speak for him, but partly what happens is that the ginning up of the emotion, the rhetorical manipulation. Now we can, that occurs, we can say, well, yeah, there are some charismatic uses of language that have great and powerful and uplifting and edifying consequences. And then there are some that can be used to the detriment of our spirits, of our souls, of our society, and of the building of, common frontiers for us to explore versus walls between us. And when you think of a guy like a Donald Trump, when you hear the stuff that he's talking about, it's pretty dispiriting. Beating up on the Mexicans and the Muslims and the women's and the blacks, and by implication, some of the gays, right? All of these languages and rhetorics, it seems to me, are rooted in a particularly and especially deleterious definition of the other versus who we are in America. So that us versus them, that Manichaean distinction is always working against the backdrop of the pure America, which is not simply about ethnic cleansing to get it pure, but also about the ways in which it begins to deracinate American society and rob us of a sense of history. And that history is especially critical now to be able to compare what Donald Trump is doing. People say it's too easy. It can't be compared to Mussolini. It can't be compared to, Hitler and so on and so forth. What he can be compared to is the manipulation of media, right? So we don't have to say he's Hitler, but we could say maybe Goebbels is a candidate. Sorry. We could say the manipulation of social media in particular, and the ways in which, as a master of that media, Donald Trump has been able to deploy his messages that have been very effective, because the people who are responding, the bigots, the assortment of biased Americans, the far-right wing, the bitter collection of white Americans who feel that they are alienated from America, that Obama represents everything that is worse for them, that the new America that he betokens is a subversion of their romantic idealism. So yeah, what Donald Trump does in terms of his speech is to organize and to amplify the worst elements. As Lincoln said, on the opposite side, not only the best angels of our nature are being, suffocated, but the worst demons of our collective imaginations are being unleashed. And I think there's not too much to say that Donald Trump represents such a serious affront, not only to American democratic values, but to the survival of a kind of spiritual compact that is a secular one that we've been able to forge in this country, that would push us beyond the boundaries of our sectarianism and allow us to have the e pluribus unum ideal. I think he's undermining that. And so when you think about what goes on, what went on in Nazi Germany, when you think about what went on at the height of the civil rights movement and the struggles for black self-determination, when you put those two things together, you see the ingenuity and the evil ingenuity of what has gone on within those Trump circles. And again, not simply Trump himself, but what he's commandeered, what he's commanded, what he's brought out, what he's been able to in one sense, give legs to, that has been so wantonly destructive in so many iterations in this country. So yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels going on there.
So let's talk about that effective messaging. I was very surprised. Well, I guess I wasn't too surprised. You had told me that in 2008, your wife, Marcia, who's also, she was a supporter, a very strong supporter of Hillary Clinton, while you were a surrogate and very strong supporter for President Obama. And now I'm pretty surprised to learn that she is a supporter of Donald Trump. And I know that's a very serious thing to discuss, but I'm just curious what the political debate at your dinner table is like these days, given that set of circumstances.
Wow. What lawyers are available? No. Yeah, Doc, it's tough up in there. It's a Nelly household. It's getting hot in here. So take off all your, your clothes of ideology. It's unbelievable to me, quite frankly. I can't even begin to comprehend, how a highly intelligent and brilliant and politically savvy black woman could in any fashion find what Donald Trump says attractive. And now I can understand Trump himself in terms of his charisma, in the forthcoming piece in the New Republic, I talk about meeting Trump. I came up out of the elevator, down at the elevator bank at 30 Rock. The elevator opens. I love you, and you've been very hard on me. He said, if I had your pipes and your brains, I'd be president now. It's like, oh my God. And he wanted to take a picture. I was like, can we do it in the corner? I don't want to be insulting. I'm a Christian. Okay, dude. Then he tells everybody, this is Michael Eric Dyson. And then my wife is on the phone. He takes the phone. Marcia, is he treating you well? That's how he got her, right there. That question right there.
That's what I wanted to
So
do.
my own personal failure has led, my existential failure has led to ideological traduction. So you know what? She had a conversation with Trump. They had many more conversations. I can't see it. I'm sure theoretically and ideally and abstractly, I could understand why somebody might believe that what Donald Trump offers could be attractive at a certain level, his charisma, but honestly, it's extremely difficult for me to understand. And I've had some of the hardest, nastiest arguments in my marriage. That ain't no secret. It's been the most difficult patch of our marriage because, when somebody tells you that, then you're trying to figure out what is the deal and who is you. And who is I? And maybe I don't know who I am. I'm waking up. It's been extremely difficult. I mean, she's made arguments. I've made arguments against. We've battled in serious fashion. I'm writing a 10,000-word piece for the New Republic against her. No. It's real tough. No, I'm just writing my Beyonce and Prince piece for you.
Yes.
But no, it's extremely tough. And look, there are some other black people that I've encountered who have supported Trump that I've argued bitterly and vigorously against, and the same is with her. So I literally, when Thomas Kuhn in The Structures of Scientific Revolution, 2nd edition, talks about incommensurable vocabularies, that's where I am right now. I just don't get it. I can't comprehend it. I don't understand it. And so there have been tremendous fights. So that's where we are right now. Okay. And a much couch dwelling for me.
Well, I hope I didn't make for any more couch dwelling.
You probably have, but don't worry.
So I'm going to ask two more questions, and then I want to give people here an opportunity to ask their own questions and make comments. But so we're in California. So I think it makes sense, given the fact that there's going to be a primary here, a Democratic primary here soon.
Right.
I know that just looking at the website 538.com this morning, they're polling, I don't know, their estimates, their predictions, excuse me. They gave Hillary a 93% chance of carrying the state. But I also noticed as I was driving along a freeway last night that I don't think it was near a rally. I don't think there was anything going on. Just a group of people had come out and draped a highway overpass with a Feel the Burn sign, and they were imploring people to honk their horns, and people were.
Right.
So who's going to win this state? Who's going to take this primary? This is a big, a lot at stake.
There's a lot at stake. Well, the Hillary people have already said, they're already like, even if we lose, we're not going to lose ultimately.
Right.
At the convention, although I think Bernie Sanders rightfully thinks that, hey, should we win California, then we got a hell of an argument. How many was it? 475 delegates? I mean, there's a lot of delegates that are at stake here. And, it's an extremely tough fight. I think Hillary Clinton can still eke it out. And I think ultimately she will be the nominee for the party. But I think similar to but with much more gravitas and power, when Jesse Jackson in '84 in San Francisco gave that speech, Our Time Is Coming, '84 and '88, when he changed the rules and basically paved the way for Barack Obama to become president with the rules change, because proportional voting came into play. And that's why Barack Obama was able to best Hillary Clinton, because if they played under the old rules, she would have been the nominee in 2008. Having said all that, I think Hillary can eke it out here. But I think it shows the vigorous character of contestation is a healthy sign for our side, right? And see, I mean, look, I love the Byrne. I love the Byrne brothers and sisters and family. But what I'm afraid of is the kind of righteous indignation that is associated with it, and the degree to which we have to be able to overcome those political differences to forge unity in the face of the onslaught that we see on the other side over there. And I think that's extremely important when it comes to specifically electoral politics, and even more broadly, a kind of vigorous, if you will, contesting of what we see going on. But it bodes well, ideally, for what goes on our side. We got tremendous debates and dialogues about inequality, about social injustice, about the means by which we can have programs that will address them. And so in that sense, I think we're far healthier than what I see going on across the aisle. But I think at the same time that should Hillary win and eke out a victory here, then it begins to stabilize what's been going on in the broader politics of the convention, and what happens eventually when we turn our attention to Donald Trump and try to defeat him in November.
Okay, so last question. This is very deeply, deeply troubling to me, and I'd hope you can explain this to me. You wrote a story recently in Slam magazine in which you said that Kobe Bryant was the greatest basketball player of all time.
I got any takers in here? I ain't got no love. I have no love. The West Coast ain't got love for Snoop Dogg? No. The West Coast ain't got love. Is that Horace? What's up, man? Ain't nobody helping me out here? Y'all ain't no Kobe. You get your book signed first, right here. I mean, you can see I'm against groupthink. I mean, who is it? Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan is the greatest force the game has seen. There's no question about that. It may turn out to be that LeBron James could be the greatest athlete we've seen, but the greatest player, ball on the court, ball through the hoop, footwork, from being a fan and aficionado of soccer when he was a child, making more complicated shots over outstretched arms of bigger defenders. I think there's no question. I've never seen a two-guard do what Kobe Bryant did. And if Michael Jordan, the other two-guard who did such extraordinary and fascinating things, was seen as the greatest and Kobe is better than him, then I would have to contend that Kobe Bryant is the greatest basketball player. Not force, not figure produced within the culture, but as a player. I ain't seen nobody better than him. Now, your guy up the road here, if he has about, Magic Johnson said, if he has about 4 more years. I just finished a story on Steph Curry as well, which is why I was late for my New Republic story. All right, a little bit. So I just finished a story on Steph, interviewed Steph, his mama, his daddy, his wife, and his brother. So I got love for Steph Curry. Steph Curry keeps up another 5 years and gets another 5 rings. I might have to write another story for Slam magazine, but right now I'm sticking with Kobe Bean Bryant under extraordinarily powerful and difficult circumstances, and for 20 years. And you dropped 60 in your last game, and you've been playing for 20 years? Michael Jordan would. All right.
All right.
That's what I say.
All right. I don't know if I'm convinced.
I know. Read the piece, think about it, meditate on it, smoke some medical marijuana.
So I want to open the forum up to some questions from the crowd, and I believe we have somebody here with a microphone who can give you an opportunity.
I want to ask about the Clintons and the '94 crime bill, everybody's favorite topic. All this ink has been spilled about it. Whether it had what effects it actually had, and what responsibility she actually has, and who the crime of the time, and some parts of black people supported it, whatever. But I think it's clear that we all, outside of the realm of politics, can agree that it was a huge mistake, right? It was putting more effort and control and power into the hands of law enforcement at a time that just had all of these negative effects. And what keeps and when Bill gets questioned about this, we get the bad bill, we get the finger wagging bill. Yeah. How dare you ask me any questions about this? And I say, what keeps them from turning around and saying, what, we made that mistake. That was a mistake, and we're going to do differently now. Is that fear of offending cops? Is that fear of offending the silent majority of white people who don't want to ever hear anything bad about cops? Like, what keeps them from defanging that by apologizing?
Yeah, that's a great point. In one of the long footnotes, I think in my book on Obama, the one we have here today, I talk about where Bill, in a foreword to a book, admits. So it's that what he did with that crime bill led to over-incarceration, led to what we see today. So it depends upon what the audience is, right? And it depends upon, and it's like anybody else with a situation. Okay, I'll confess my sins, but if you start jamming me up for it and I'm in public, then I'm going to start getting defensive and saying some of the worst things that I could imagine saying, and Bill Clinton has been caught in that situation where he's now looking condescending, he's looking didactic, he's looking hypocritical. And in other places, when he went before the NAACP convention where he admitted that what he had done was problematic, and in his best moments he would still acknowledge that, but there's a lot at stake there. There's a lot at stake because when you're saying it in the midst of a political campaign where your wife is running for president, then you have a different mindset, and your legacy is at stake, and you were used to being feted as the first black president, and the real first black president came along and stole your thunder. Sorry, I'm a real brother. Right? Right, even though people have been debating that, right? So he's been having a hard time too. If the real brother got problems, what you think the fake brother got, right? And on the other hand, what's more complicated, of course, is the fact that, and people, you saw the New York Times piece and people said, but a lot of black people, which is true, a lot of black politicians were involved and supported it. Jesse Jackson, in the famous C-SPAN testimony that got circulated a few months ago, was warning about how problematic that bill would be. Many people saw it. Bernie Sanders signed on and voted for it, right? But also because he thought that there were deterrents to crime that needed to be addressed. And people sneak stuff in bills, right? Because they're never pure. Bills are representative and symbolic themselves of the process, the sausage-making process of democracy. People put rioters on them and attachments to them and stuff but I ain't gonna vote for you unless you vote for this. And it's not just about pork, it's also about spite. And it's about directing resources toward the more vulnerable or denying them of those resources. So partly what we see going on here is that, there was complicity on all sides. Even black people, if you read Michael Fortner's book, and you can argue with him, you read Khalil Gibran Muhammad's brilliant book review of Michael Fortner's book in the New York Times. But if you read Michael Fortner's book as well, he was arguing that the Rockefeller laws in New York were forged by a consensus that was generated between black ministers, black people on the ground, and governments trying to figure out what to do with this out-of-control crime. So a lot of people's hands were dirty, and blood was on a lot of people's hands in '94. A lot of people were wrong. The super predator language was wrong. It was generated by John DiIulio, and then, at Penn and then Princeton, and he then recanted. We'd like to see a more vigorous recanting by our political figures on that. But I always found it interesting, people say, well, Hillary's culpability here. Now, as a private citizen, you can say, the stuff you said in defense of your husband and so on has to be taken into account, but she wasn't elected in an office. She wasn't the vice president. She wasn't the secretary of state and the like. She was helping her husband. The same way we're going to look at Michelle and say, hey, Michelle Obama was down with Obama on X, Y, and Z. Now, should she run for public office, I'm sure that her record then would be vulnerable. But the point is that we want it both ways when it comes to Hillary Clinton in terms of her role and the definition of her role and the like. So everybody has to be held accountable. And part of that defensiveness has to do with being saddled with what Bill Clinton is probably thinking is that, hey, I had a lot of black people in my ear telling me that you ought to sign that bill because crack cocaine is devastating black communities. And crack cocaine is a drug like we've never seen. And it's much more feral and much more destructive than even powder cocaine. Now you got to ask, who are his black advisors? They probably don't want to come out the woodworks now and say, hey, it was me. But the reality is he's got that going on at the same time. So I think there's a lot of complicity and a lot of if you will, culpability to go around. And the reality is it was destructive, it was problematic, it led to the prison industrial complex, but the rapid proliferation of black and brown bodies, and for that matter, even some poor white ones in these institutions, suggests that even 20 years ago, we couldn't understand and began to appreciate just how much more those prisons would be swollen with the bodies of our fellow citizens who happen to be black and brown.
Hey, I've got a question. Okay. Thank you very much. And that last question was my first question, so I'll go with my second. My question is about voter disenfranchisement. So I'm thinking specifically about Nevada and Arizona. Specifically in Arizona, polling places for lower income and people of color majority areas were shut down in the Arizona primaries, and I know Bernie has pretty loudly been blaming the DNC and Debbie Wasserman Schultz for her, outstanding bias for Hillary Clinton. And I guess my question is, do you put any fault on Hillary or on the DNC for this, voter disenfranchisement we've seen in New York, Nevada, Arizona, et cetera?
Right. Look, I think that we got to be above board with all the practices. It's not like this is my candidate, therefore I'm going to turn a blind eye or deaf ear, but this is not my candidate, so I'm going to excoriate them. Look, we have to have a uniform code of behavior that regulates and governs what we do, that we say lends itself toward democratic practice. And if it ain't, I don't care who, I don't care Hillary, Bernie, who. It's wrong. And I think that we need as many people voting as possible. We can't possibly, mount an argument against voter disenfranchisement on the other side. The Republican attempt to systematically defraud and undermine the ability of elder Americans, including groupings of Jewish Americans in Florida, along with African Americans and younger people, that those systematic attempts to undermine their voting because they are reliably democratic can't be reasonably and cogently argued without at the same time saying, let's clean up the practices in our own house, so to speak. So I think that whether it's Debbie Wasserman Schultz or Hillary Clinton or or Bernie making an argument, it's not simply, people say, well, it's about paranoia, and what you're doing is ginning up the argument so deeply and profoundly that it undermines our sense of the sense of reliability among the voterate in their party, and therefore you're undermining it. No, if it's wrong and it was problematic, it needs to be addressed. And I have no truck with any kind of practices that would deny the legitimacy of that. It's just that when we make those claims and those arguments, let's not do it out of a sense of hyperbole or paranoia, but out of empirically verifiable practices that need to be addressed.
I think we have a question over here.
Good afternoon, Reverend.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
In the unlikely event that Trump becomes president, and he has to deal with the realities of the presidency and all those various things that are involved in that. His current supporters, would you anticipate a backlash from them and turning against Trump because he could not follow through on many of the things that he's saying currently? And what would that backlash look like in your estimation?
Wow, one could only pray.
I want you to write about that next month.
Yeah, no, that's...
I'm going to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a hell of a point, actually.
That's a great question.
You know what? But if we look at the predictable patterns of what we think are crypto-fascist practices or fascism light, or the degree to which people who have been manipulated then get outraged, if we look at the predictable patterns there, then yeah, people, in power like that abuse the people to get into office and then end up disappointing them inevitably. Why? Because it was never built upon, anything but a house of cards to begin with. Because all the stuff Donald Trump talking about, I mean, if people are jumping on Bernie Sanders, How are you going to fund it? Your kind of Eurocentric conception of socialism is not driven by a real engagement with the possibility of redistributive mechanisms in America, all right? So we can make all those arguments. But if you got that argument with Bernie Sanders, what you got with Donald Trump, right? Like hocus pocus politics, right? Legerdemain politics, like just made it up. Like shit you said, shit my dad said, and shit Donald Trump said, now he's president, right? That's a great point you raise. I think that there will be a backlash, a retaliation, a spoiling, because Donald Trump cannot possibly, in any measurable effect, bring to bear what he's talking about. Because first of all, the government don't work that way. I'm going to build a fence, and I'm get the Mexicans to pay for it. You know, it didn't even work that way. The wall, I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way, dude. I'm going to ban all the Muslims. Right? The mayor of London has already said, I'm getting here before a possible Donald Trump presidency because I won't be able to get in otherwise. Right? Urbane, witty, sophisticated Muslim brother up against an orange specter. Right? John Boehner on steroids. But I love his calling my man Ted the devil. Could you have some of that for Trump too? So I think that the predictable pattern of reaction is the spoiling of the very people who have been duped by the charismatic figure, and a kind of recognition that collapsed in on itself. That what have we done? But the problem is, it may not simply be a retaliation against Trump. It can also concomitantly be a coarsening of the rhetoric and a deepening of the hostility against the people who are seen as making Trump responsible for failing. Yeah. So that people of color and all the other people Donald Trump is beating up on, had you people just agreed and fallen into line, then President Trump would have been more successful. So you got that simultaneous thing operating on each flank. But that's a hell of a point. I think there's reaction and resentment, and I think there's finger pointing as well. Because one of the true characteristics of those who have been abused by such charismatic figures is a lack of self-awareness as the predicate for political engagement.
Do we have time for
one more question?
For one more? Okay.
Thank you for very insightful comments.
Thank you, sir.
In fact, connected to the previous question, you've said a lot about Obama, but what's your opinion of the rest of the black political leadership, and who do you see rising to the fore in a post-Obama world articulating these issues?
Particularly?
Issues relating to the black community.
Right. Well, yeah, it's an interesting post-Obama world. Right here in this area, you've got Sister Kamala Harris, who's a rising star. Is she going to become senator? All right, she's going to become, senator. Forget that Supreme Court spot that Obama might have chosen, instead choosing a predictable figure. Let me say this. You didn't ask me this, but I got to say this about Obama. People were defending Obama. I got into a big argument. We were honoring Eric Holder a couple weeks ago, and I had to speak. And one of the other speakers for Holder was saying, I think you've been too tough on Obama, and so on and so forth. And especially with this Supreme Court choice he made, I think this guy is a perfect stealth candidate. He'll get up in there and do stuff. I said, bruh, if you're playing chess, not checkers, no matter who you choose will never be taken seriously by the Republicans now. And you have to depend upon the Democrats winning to extend your legacy and therefore put the person in office. Why not then choose a black woman so that when Hillary wins, if that's your hedged bet in terms of extending your legacy, who will be in place to be nominated and then confirmed but a black woman who has never served on the Supreme Court versus another white guy who has, which at the end of the day suggests that we keep making excuses for Obama in terms of what the situation was, the calculus about what he had to do. Maybe at the end of the day, that's just what he believes. And that's even harder for some of us to take and stomach. That he just is a centrist dude who don't want too much progressive stuff going on, incremental half-loafing the game. And I think problematically so, because he said when he went to Chicago, back to the University of Chicago Law School, he said, it's not like I went to Skokie where my, what's his name, the Supreme Court guy who's been nominated, David Garland. All right.
Yeah.
He says, it's not like I went to Skokie asking for a black lesbian. That's what Obama said. Now, that went under the radar. That calls for commentary, right? Because if a white man had said that, oy vey, that'd have been messed up, Jack. Like, can you believe that the white man went, I didn't go to Skokie looking for a Negro progressive. Obama goes, I didn't go looking for a black lesbian. Maybe you should have. Because the default position of excellence, the adjudicative force between competing claims of competency, is the white man as the default. I was looking for the best, not for and the best always turns out to be a white man. So what you're doing is re-articulating the logic of those who claim, we looked for a woman, but we couldn't find one. We looked for a black, but we couldn't find one. We looked for a Latino, but we couldn't find one. So we had to choose the best, which is a white guy, right? So Obama, I think, perpetuates a legacy of corrupted logic there. But back to what you asked me. If Obama is in, what Obama has shown is that the kind of centrist black figure is appealing. So could that be Deval Patrick? Could that be Cory Booker? Right? But hopefully, if Obama is Jackie Robinson, maybe we get a Willie Mays next time. Say, hey kids, San Fran, what's up? Giants, what up? What it look like? I know they say Barry Bonds is the greatest pure hitter in the game, but I don't know. He was great, but Willie Mays was a monster too. So after Jackie Robinson, who was not the best ball player, but the best ball player suited for the task at hand. He was a great ball player, but not the greatest. But he could take the guff and the heat from the establishment and from the haters in ways that many others couldn't. So that constituted an advantage and a virtue in the calculus as to who to choose first. So Obama is like Jackie Robinson because he just takes it. So much of the nastiness that comes his way, and he's so calm with it. Part of that is Hawaii, right? Part of that is his makeup that he puts on every morning. No, part of that is his makeup emotionally, and part of that is learning how to negotiate as a biracial figure in America with competing ethnic and racial interests. So he's the ideal guy, but maybe behind the Willie Mays or the Wilma Rudolph, right, is behind him, who will break that mold and be able to be a bit more self-consciously articulate about the issues of race in ways that Obama did. Let me give another example. So Obama goes to Detroit a few months ago, taking a well-deserved victory lap for bailing out the automobile industry. What did Romney say? Let him eat brakes. Oh, come on, man. Come on, man. That was kind of good. Right? Forget it. Don't bail him out. Let it be messed up. Obama said, no, we're going to bail him out. Did a brilliant thing. So while Obama is in Detroit, Flint, Michigan is 60 miles up the road. They are already in crisis. And he doesn't, it ain't like he got to get on Delta Flight 1777. He got a plane, I heard. And 60 miles up the road, you can just take one of them motorcades. Go visit the people. He cries in the White House about the children, as he should have, of Newtown. And standing behind him, a phalanx of Americans who embrace his politics of empathy. And he said, it's the worst day of his presidency, and I understand that. And he and Holder went there in the immediate aftermath and saw the bloodbath. But you ain't been to Chicago. And you won't go to Flint, both of which are predominantly African American. You can't cry where you don't go. What we might have used with an empathetic president who could help America cry over the devastation of these people, to not see it as a merely ethnicized, racialized problem, but an American problem. And I think in that sense, what we hope comes behind Obama in a post-Obama era is the ability to be more explicit about the politics of empathy that happens to embrace those people of color who, after all, are American citizens. I'll end by saying this. Obama says, hey, I'm not the president of black America. True, but you are the president of black Americans. You may not be the president of black America, but you are the president of black Americans. We are citizens as well. So our issues are serious. And what he ends up doing is unconsciously pitting black people, exacerbating tensions between gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual people, whom he tends to embrace openly because he's not perceived as and is not consciously one of them. So since that ain't my group, I can hook y'all up. But since y'all my group over here, I will go out of my way to deliver condescending lectures that excoriate you in public as opposed to the politics of empathy. You didn't ask for all that, but thank you for allowing me to put a rider on that question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to this panel.